So we're now going to hear about a project that looks at human responses to changing conditions in redwood forests, with the ultimate aim of effectively engaging visitors inspired by these iconic forests to spur climate action. We will be hearing today from Maria DiGiano, and she's a senior research senior research associate whose work focuses on community-based natural resource management, land tenure, and perceptions of rights and resources. We also wish to acknowledge Nicole Ardoin's work in this area, and unfortunately she won't be able to join us today for family reasons, but we really appreciate you, Maria, being here. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, and I really appreciate the invitation to participate in what's been a really great event thus far, and just hearing so many different perspectives on climate change, impacts, and what we can do to mitigate those impacts. So I'm going to be sharing a presentation today on behalf of my colleagues here. Let me see that if I can make sure to do this properly. Let's see, that looks like it's working. Okay, hoping everybody can see my screen, right?
We can see it, thanks.
Great, thank you. So yeah, I'm presenting on behalf of a bigger team led by Professor Nicole Ardoin, who's in the Graduate School of Education at Stanford, and also a fellow with Woods Institute for Environment and the faculty director of the Emmett Interdisciplinary Program on Environment and Resources at Stanford. And also we have contributions from graduate students, other researchers, and even undergrads who've participated in this project. So I'm going to be sharing two pieces of our research that focus on connecting and caring in California's redwood forests. So before I dig into the research itself, I just want to talk a little bit about what social science can contribute to our understanding of the environment and its problems. We've heard so much great research this morning, really looking at forest ecology, climate change and its impacts, and we know that our understanding of healthy and resilient ecosystems has greatly improved over the past several decades. And we've learned a lot about those advances just this morning already. And one thing is increasingly clear, perhaps this year more than ever, with the global pandemic and wildfires and natural disasters exacerbated by climate change, that we really can't separate people and the environment. So when we think about environmental problems like drought or wildfire or hurricanes, they're not necessarily only environmental problems. They're really fundamentally people problems as well. They're often the result of human behaviors and choices at many different scales, from the individual scale to the collective scale. So when we think about human behavior, it's shaped by many, many factors. It's shaped by our culture, our beliefs and attitudes, how we think about our ability to affect change in the world. It's the result of our choices. It's a result of policies where we live at local, regional, national, and international scales. And it's also shaped by economic incentives. So it's pretty complicated business. And our job as social scientists is often to try to untangle and think about human behavior, and then how we can apply those findings to try and sometimes change human behavior to address some of these environmental problems. So really, when we're talking about resilient forests, we're not just talking about forest health and maintaining ecosystem services, but we're also talking about maintaining and enhancing the diverse social, economic, and cultural services that forests provide for visitors and residents alike. So in the Stanford Social Ecology Lab, we're really interested in this relationship between people and the environment. And with this particular project or projects, we're looking at the relationship between people and redwood forests. So we began these projects as part of a larger cross-institutional and interdisciplinary study of climate change impacts on California's coastal redwoods. That was called the SUMAN project. So this involved forest ecologists, climate scientists, and this was really looking at the relationship between shifting fog patterns and climate change in coastal redwood forests. And many of the forest ecologists and climate scientists on the team were investigating what's happening with the number of foggy days in redwood forests, and what's the impact that we see when those foggy days decrease over time? And so our team, led by Dr. Nicole Ardoin, was tasked with understanding how people living around and visiting California's coastal redwoods connect with these iconic landscapes, and understand the changes happening in those landscapes, and how these connections can or may inspire greater awareness of climate change, and in turn, what we call pro-environmental behaviors, or sort of environmentally friendly behaviors. So just to emphasize that more than just capturing people's experiences in forests, we really wanted to contemplate, how do we leverage those experiences in redwood forest to inspire a deeper connection to nature, which in turn can motivate some of these behaviors and hopefully broaden the dialogue around climate change and its impacts, which we know is so important here in Marin and California. And also thinking about the number of people that are visiting Marin and Muir Woods National Monument, it has the potential to have a broader impact. So I'm going to talk specifically about two studies that we conducted in partnership with Muir Woods National Monument and in Muir Woods specifically. So the first study I'm going to be talking about is called Tree Mail, and it's based on a postcard writing activity that was actually designed and implemented by the interpretive staff at Muir Woods National Monument. They started this back in 2016, and they set up this postcard writing kiosk in the park, pictured here. Maybe some of you have seen it or even submitted a postcard. And they asked visitors to write a postcard message to the redwood trees. So you can read the prompt that they put up to inspire people to think about what messages they would want to send to trees. And over a 3-year time period, they collected close to 1,000 postcards, and they kindly shared these postcards with our team so that we could analyze them to better understand how visitors were connecting with the redwood forest. So now, before I share what we found from visitors' postcards, I'd like to invite you to take a moment and imagine yourself in a redwood forest, whether that's Muir Woods or someplace close to your home, and just think for a moment about what message you would like to write to the trees. And if you feel comfortable, please share this in the chat box, or write it down on a piece of paper, just to think about what message you might want to write to the trees. And then we can explore a little bit if some of the themes that we found are also apparent in your messages. I'm not going to necessarily read any of these messages aloud, one, because I can't see the chat box right now, but that's okay. But just, I think, for you all to see them. Okay, I'm just going to let you finish wrapping up your message. Okay. I'm going to go on now to talk a little bit about what we found from these postcards to trees. And tell you a little bit about the research process itself. So as I mentioned, thanks to the Muir Woods staff, we had close to 1,000 postcards. And once we went through all of the ones written in English and the ones that we could actually decipher the handwriting, we ended up with 747 postcards that we could use. And we had a great team of undergrads at Stanford that helped us scan each of these postcards and transcribe them. And then we proceeded to code them according to different themes that we had expected to find, and then ones that emerged from the postcards themselves. And so I'm going to now share some of the common themes that we found and see if you see some of yourself and your messages in these postcards. So through the analysis of visitor cards, we were able to decipher some of the values that people placed in forests they came across in these cards. So perhaps not surprising, or wasn't necessarily surprising to us, that the overwhelming majority of the cards, some 85% of the cards, reference different aspects of connection to nature, whether it was the simple, pure enjoyment of being in nature, sharing their love of trees or nature, their love of the place, recognizing the beauty, the awe and wonder that they experienced, all these different aspects of connection to nature. We also found themes related to empathizing with the trees, seeing things from their perspective, a sense of oneness with the trees, and also a sense of responsibility to trees. There are so many beautiful postcards, and I'm not going to be able to share all of them right now, but I am going to read a couple that, one in particular that captures some of the themes I just mentioned. This one says, "Thank you, all of the teachers in life. Your lessons resonate and apply at any time in life. On behalf of the human race, I'm sorry we've lost sight and I've taken you all for granted, but change is coming. You're worth so much more. We all are. Thank you for teaching love and community and perseverance and growth. We are one." So that message to trees encapsulates a lot of the themes I just mentioned above, empathizing with trees, a sense of oneness, and a sense of responsibility. And about a third of the cards reference some dimensions of place. So some sense of place or connection to place, whether it was recognizing a dependence on trees, dependence on the place for oxygen, for the air we breathe, for providing shelter, shelter for animals. Some reference the forest as their church or their home, their escape, their safe haven. Others recalled specific place-based memories of spending time in Muir Woods with loved ones or remembering loved ones who had passed away. So here's another really beautiful one. It says, "I've been coming here my entire life. I am now 16 years old. These trees, these redwoods, and all the redwoods across the coast have always been there for me. I come here sad and leave this place with a peace I can't describe. So thank you." So as you can see in the two quotes that I just read, gratitude was a theme that's really interwoven throughout these messages from visitors to trees. Some people express gratitude for the sheer beauty and enjoyment of the place. They also express gratitude and recognition for our dependence on trees and what we gain from trees, whether that's the oxygen or keeping us and animals safe and protected. They also thank the trees for providing them with a cultural and spiritual resource, connecting visitors to their loved ones and ancestors, or for providing perspective and reminding us of our place in this world, our place in this ecosystem, like this postcard on the slide is showing. So why is this important? Why does this help us support? Why do these findings help us support the notion of resiliency in these ecosystems? I'll just provide two perspectives here. So first, by analyzing these messages, we can better understand the ways that diverse people connect to the place and to redwoods in particular. And they also might provide insight into how we could design interventions or educational activities that can foster and enhance these connections to place. That could help us take away some of these feelings and emotions away from the park and integrate them into our daily lives. So we can build on what we know from other fields, for example, that have shown that connection to place and connection to nature actually informs more environmentally friendly behaviors. We can also look to fields like positive psychology, which has done a lot of work in looking at the practice of gratitude and the process of expressing gratitude, that it can actually improve people's well-being and help them cope with uncertainty. And certainly with climate change, we're dealing with a lot of uncertainty. We also know from thinking about how people learn that reflecting on our experiences, this process of reflection, helps us to sort of meld our emotional experiences with the cognitive and learning aspects of a visitor's experience in a place like Muir Woods. So we can contextualize the findings from this postcard study in those other fields that hopefully can allow us to take action on that knowledge. So for these reasons, looking at these postcards is actually important when we think about how we move from a visitor's experience in a beautiful, amazing landscape like Muir Woods, and then taking that home and having that experience actually motivate them to do something, to take some action. So I'm going to now move on to the second study that I mentioned. And this was actually a survey of visitors to Muir Woods National Monument. And I'd like to just, before I get started, take a quick poll to know how many of you all have visited Muir Woods National Monument. I imagine many of you are quite familiar with Muir Woods. So just get a sense of how many of you have experienced this place. Just give you a moment to finish that up. Okay, so we've got over 50% said too many times to keep count. And we have just a very small percentage that have never been there or have only been there once. So a lot of you all can imagine the place and the experience of visiting the place. And maybe you perhaps even saw our research team out there when we were doing this study in the summer of 2019. So the goal of this study was to understand how park visitors experience and connect with redwoods. Also to understand what their attitudes and concerns were about climate change. And importantly, what were some of the, what we call pro-environmental behaviors that they were engaging in the past, and what was their willingness to engage in those kinds of behaviors in the future. So this diagram shows you, gives you a quick overview of our study design, where we conducted a survey of visitors immediately following their visit to Muir Woods. So we stationed ourselves at the entrance or the exit to the park and asked them to fill out about a 10 to 15 minute survey. And then we followed up with them 3 minutes later to ask them some additional questions similar to the ones that we had asked at the time of their visit. Now, we also had a second group of visitors in which we did the same process, but in between, you know, as they were hiking, we gave them a group of reflection cards, a set of cards that were designed to inspire conversation and reflection in two distinct ways. So the first was to inspire reflection on their connection to nature. So thinking about this issue of fog that I mentioned at the very beginning, when we were partnering with forest ecologists and climate scientists that were noticing that the number of foggy days were decreasing, we gave visitors that piece of information and asked them to reflect upon that. And also thinking about what this place looked like 100 years ago, what it looks like today, and imagining what Muir Woods would look like 100 years from now. And a second theme of the cards was about taking action. So having people reflect on the kinds of actions that led to the establishment of Muir Woods National Monument, the types of advocacy and collective action efforts, and then also asking people to reflect on what kinds of actions they might take at home. So we had several hypotheses that we wanted to test. So one was that we thought people with a stronger place attachment, a connection to the redwoods, would demonstrate higher levels, higher frequency of what we call these pro-environmental behaviors. And this is based on what we know from past studies about looking at people's connection to nature and connection to place. And we also expected or hoped to find that people reflecting on their connection to nature and learning about the vulnerabilities of coastal redwoods, that might inform a greater willingness to engage in some of these pro-environmental behaviors in the future. So to give you a quick sort of glance at our study in numbers, or our study population, we surveyed close to 1,000 visitors at Muir Woods National Monument on site at the time of their visit. Of those 1,000, we had about a third that took the follow-up survey, which is not that atypical when you do that kind of post-study type of survey. We had almost 80% non-local visitors, a little more than half were women. The average age of the visitors was 41. And we asked people to sort of self-report where they fit on a political spectrum, from very liberal to very conservative. So we had about 22% that identified as either conservative or very conservative. Just important to sort of keep in mind that our population skewed a bit towards the liberal side of things. And just also to put this in context of Muir Woods and their visitation rate, I think in 2019, they've had about 800,000 visitors. So just thinking about not only the amount that we were able to sample from that population, but just the impact of Muir Woods National Monument and the number of people visiting that park is pretty astounding. So I'm going to now present some very high-level findings from this study to give you a sense of what we found and what might be important in this conversation here. So like I said, we wanted to find out how people connected to nature and how people connected to redwoods in particular. So we asked visitors about their sense of connection to nature in general, using a well-known scale that's called the Inclusion with Nature scale. And we found that visitors, for the most part, saw themselves as part of nature. You can see from the bottom row that close to 3/4 of the visitors saw themselves, you know, either equally overlapping self and nature or really going towards sort of the full overlap of self and nature. This was also expressed in an attachment to redwood forests. So visitors expressed that they felt some connection to redwood forests, which is, we asked them a series of statements such as, when I'm in a redwood forest, I feel connected to nature. Redwood forests are special to me. I have memories attached to redwood forests. And from there, we sort of took a composite of people's level of agreement with those statements. And on average, the score across all of those items was pretty high, which meant that on average, people felt an attachment to redwood trees, which is interesting, considering that many of the visitors were not actually from the area. This was, as you remember, just after their visit, their walk through the park. And many of the people also responded that their visit to Muir Woods National Monument enhanced their connection to redwood. So 43.5%. You know, a couple said, my visit today increased my motivation to learn more about preservation efforts and laws to protect redwood forests. And another said, I had never experienced the redwoods before. They feel sacred. We also found that visitors, for the most part, expressed concern about climate change. And I know that in previous years, maybe 10 years ago, there was this notion of a lack of consensus about concern about climate change. And obviously for our study population, you know, it's not representative of the nation as a whole, but we found that, in fact, more than 3/4 of the visitors we surveyed responded that climate change was very important or extremely important to them personally. And 80% responded that they believe climate change would impact redwood forests in the future. So one visitor commented in the survey, and again, just reminding you that these are people who are not necessarily from California. One said, I'm not sure about California, but Louisiana, where I'm from, is losing coastline at an alarming rate. So climate change may change California's climate and ecology. And we found that, interestingly, those who had received the reflection cards, many people mentioned the impact of fog when we asked them specifically what they were concerned about. So they said things like less fog, less moisture, less growth, less habitat. So some concerns about the decrease in foggy days. So this was something that we qualitatively found as a result of the reflection card exercise that we didn't see in those folks who hadn't received the reflection cards, this concern with fog. And visitors were concerned both at the time of their visit and then when we surveyed them 3 months later. And we asked visitors also a series of questions about what we call sort of like enabling conditions. Do they have the knowledge to take action to reduce the effects of climate change? Do they feel comfortable taking action? Do they have the time to take action? Do they have the money to take action? And so many people said on average, they somewhat agreed that they had the money, the knowledge, the time, while there was some variation among visitors. So what we were ultimately really interested in was looking at people's behavior. So how did all of these attitudes and connection to nature, that connection to redwoods, their concern about climate change, their sense of their ability to take action, how do these actually impact behaviors? And so we measured reported behaviors in the past. We asked visitors to report on the kinds of behaviors they had been doing for the previous 3 months. And then we asked them about their willingness to engage in different behaviors in the future. And we had 3, what I'll call buckets of behaviors. So the first was social behavior. So are they talking to people about environmental issues? The second were what we called activist behaviors. So such as working with others, participating in an environmental group, voting, signing a petition letter, writing to senators. And the third were philanthropic behaviors, so donating money to environmental causes. What's interesting is that in leaving the park, we found that visitors reported engaging in pro-environmental behaviors rarely to occasionally. And so we found this gap that between what their connection and concern and what they were actually doing. And so and at the time of their visit, they also said that they were moderate behaviors. They were probably inspired, pumped up during their visit, and said that they were willing to engage in all of these behaviors. And yet when we surveyed these visitors 3 months later, the reported behaviors were pretty stable. So they were still engaging at the same level in these kinds of social activist and donation behaviors, rarely to occasionally. And when we asked them about their future willingness at that 3 month later time point, they almost sort of recalibrated their expectations and sort of downgraded their willingness to engage in those behaviors in the future. So that's an interesting finding there. And we found two variables were really key in shaping these behavioral outcomes. So one was age and the other is connection to place. So I'm gonna talk a little bit more about these in the very few minutes that I have left. So I'm going to try and wrap this up. So first, when we look at age, it seemed that older visitors were more likely to already be engaging in environmental activism and donations before even visiting the park. So they were reporting a higher frequency of these types of behaviors when we surveyed them. And they also said that they would be more willing to engage in these kinds of behaviors in the future. And we found that 3 months after their visit, in fact, older visitors were more likely to increase their pro-environmental social outreach. So they had not reported doing as much social behavior at the time of the visit, and then they kind of shored up that weak area and were actually doing more social behavior. So when we looked a little bit at why, we conducted what's called a mediation analysis to understand the relationships between these different variables. And we found that the relationship between age and environmental activism and environmental philanthropy was mediated by the feeling that you had enough money to take action on climate change. So it kind of goes back to this question of those enabling conditions. So what does that mean? It means that as people age, and this is probably not surprising for many of you watching, that perhaps there's a feeling of financial comfort that increases, and it might help motivate more activism and philanthropy. So we think that the observed age effects on environmental behavior are driven by this, but certainly there are a lot of limitations in this study in terms of the specific behaviors that we were asking about, and potentially the kinds of folks that engaged in our survey 3 months later that we could look more into. So lastly, I want to talk about connection to place, and that's the other variable that's really driving an increase in these pro-environmental behaviors. So we found that the more people felt attached to redwood forests, the greater their past and future, their past behaviors and their willingness to engage in those behaviors in the future. So that's really a really interesting finding. And in fact, this connection to redwoods was the only environmental attitude associated with people improving behaviors over the 3 months following their visit. So in other words, it outperformed being concerned on climate change, beliefs about one's ability to influence environmental issues, and more. So, unfortunately, we can't untangle the connection to redwoods that visitors felt prior to their visit, since we were only asking them at the time of their visit. So we don't quite understand yet what is the mechanism that's driving that connection during the visit itself. But it's interesting to think about when we consider the study population was mostly non-local people. So this suggests that we can't necessarily assume a prior connection to redwood forests, and that perhaps that visitor experiences, even short term, is one pathway to really amp up one's connection to a specific place and to nature in general. So I realize I'm running out of time here, and I want to just sum up with some opportunities and challenges to enhance connection and caring to support resilient forests. So I think both of the studies I talked about, Tree Mail and the survey, point to the fact that even short-term experiences in nature and redwood forests in particular may deepen people's connection with nature and can serve as a pathway to cultivate and enhance people's relationship to forests. And it can help foster different kinds of environmental behaviors, whether that's social behaviors or donation behaviors. All of those are really critical for forests and us living as people within these ecosystems. So the challenges are, how do we understand the full range of values people have in nature? And I think this touches upon some of what the other panelists have been talking about. and especially Teresa's presentation earlier about how to reach diverse populations and make sure that they are included in this space. And I think looking at visitors' narratives and understanding the values that diverse people place in nature is one way to ensure that whatever parks are doing and the interventions are really speaking to everybody that should be included in these spaces. And then the second challenge is really, how do we translate these experiences that can be so monumental and so amazing in these iconic landscapes back to our homes to sustain action and behavior change? As we saw in our study, there was a gap between what people believe their connection to be and what they were actually doing. So, this is something we can work on as an opportunity to think about how we can sustain those behaviors, and perhaps reflection exercises like the ones in the postcards are one pathway to help people reflect and merge the emotional connection they feel in these spaces to their actual behaviors and learning that's happening in those spaces. So I'm going to leave you all with a call to action for all of you all listening and tuning into the summit to go and visit your parks, bring others, and think about ways that you can really reflect on your experience and bring them back to your home life. So I want to say thank you and apologies for running a minute over there. I was hoping to have some time for questions. And I encourage you all to engage in a sort of reflection project that we're doing now, which is called Dear Planet Earth. And you can click on this website, and we actually have some really beautiful postcards that we are asking people to reflect on what's keeping them hopeful, because we see this as a potential pathway to action and resiliency for all of us living in these really unprecedented times. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria. That was a very moving presentation, and I hope you'll take a chance to see the beautiful contributions that you invited people to put in the chat room, and also for underscoring the value of place and forests to move us, and also the value of parks as outdoor labs, research places. I'd like to thank our speakers for the broad discussion of resilient forests, from the science of what's happening due to climate change and tools for science-based management, to understanding the 2020 fire season we're in the midst of, to the social dimensions of experiencing forests. I personally have been very moved and informed by today's speakers, as well as motivated to take today's presentations into my work. I also feel very proud today to be a Californian after learning of Governor Newsom's executive order yesterday to dedicate 30% of our lands in California to open space, wildlife, plants, other living species by 2030. We want to end by emphasizing the power of forests to inspire, to both heal us and energize us toward taking action on climate change, and how important it is that all people have access to that inspiration for our sake and for the sake of forests. Lastly, a couple of reminders. We have 3 more sessions to go. We'll see you back here next week to discuss sea level rise and our evolving shorelines. Please encourage your colleagues, classmates, and neighbors to join us all. You can still sign up for upcoming sessions. Please also check the chat room. Many links have been posted and other opportunities. We also want to remind you to check the Summit website for additional resources around today's themes and for all the sessions if you'd like to learn more. There are also still 2 special sessions that you can sign up for on building an inclusive climate movement. Those are on October 27th and 29th, and you can sign up at the Summit website for those 2. Thank you so much to all of our speakers and to all of you in the audience today for tuning in and participating. See you next week.